A 72-year-old Navy SEAL veteran walked into a small-town bar for a quiet drink and got kicked out because of who he was. Less than 24 hours later, the people who served beside him showed up and changed everything. Zeke Harmon didn't walk like he used to. Time and war had rearranged the bones in his knees and left a dull ache in his lower back. But he still carried himself like a man who remembered discipline. Shoulders square, chin up, eyes steady. He parked his old Ford Ranger right outside Rusty Jack's Tavern, a squat, low-roofed bar with faded lettering and an old Budweiser sign that hadn't lit up in years. It was a Tuesday, just after 4 in the afternoon. The kind of hour when the regulars sip their beer slow, the kitchen smells of grease, and the only noise is whatever game's playing on the TV. Zeke wasn't from Bardstown, but he'd been staying with his niece for a week just outside town. He didn't know the local places too well, but the tavern looked quiet. That's all he wanted. Quiet. A beer. Maybe a rerun of the Wildcats game. Nothing more. He stepped inside, pushing the door open with a firm hand. The place had 6 or 7 patrons inside, mostly older men, a few women at the bar, and a skinny guy in a trucker hat playing pool solo. The room smelled like beer, wood polish, and onion rings. There was a slow country song playing on the jukebox, and 2 ceiling fans that spun with a lazy whir. Zeke walked toward the bar and slid onto a stool. He placed his worn cap, black with the gold trident of the SEALs, gently beside him and waited. Behind the counter was Clint Radisson. Big guy. Mid-50s. Beard trimmed sharp, but eyes that always looked like they were squinting at something they didn't like. Clint had owned the bar for nearly a decade. Locals said he got more bitter every year. He walked over, looked Zeke up and down, long and slow, and said, "Can I help you with something?" Zeke answered simply, "Yeah, Budweiser, if you got it." But Clint didn't move. He just stared. Then he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the woman next to him to hear, "We don't serve your kind here." The room got quiet. The pool cue stopped mid-shot. Someone cleared their throat. Zeke turned slightly, eyes narrowing, like he wasn't sure he heard right. "Say again," he asked, calm but firm. "You heard me," Clint said louder now. "Don't care who you were or what war you think you fought. We don't need problems here." Zeke looked around. No one said a word. The air felt thicker. One of the waitresses, young, maybe 19, stared at her shoes. Another older man near the back set down his glass gently, like it might shatter if he made a sound. Zeke stood, slow and steady. No rush. His cap in one hand. He didn't shout, didn't push. He just looked Clint in the eye and said, "I've bled for this country. More than once. And it damn sure wasn't for people like you." He turned and walked toward the door. Someone near the jukebox whispered, "That guy's a SEAL." Another voice, older, replied, "He was a SEAL. Ezekiel Harmon. That's him." Zeke didn't stop. He pushed the door open and walked out, the screen door slapping shut behind him. As he stepped back into the sunlight, he didn't look back once. But Clint did. He watched from behind the bar, jaw tight, fingers gripping the edge of the counter. One of the old guys near the pool table finally said, "That man's got more honor in his pinky than you'll ever have behind this bar." But Clint just barked, "Anybody got a problem? They know where the door is." Outside, Zeke climbed into his truck. He didn't cry, didn't curse. He sat there a moment, breathing slow, hands on the wheel. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated like that, but it still hit like it was. But as word spread through the town over the next few hours, something started moving that Clint Radisson didn't see coming. By sunset, whispers had already reached the edge of Bardstown. Not through social media or news alerts, just old-fashioned word of mouth. A waitress called her brother. A customer told his wife. The older man near the jukebox made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. And all of them mentioned the same name. Zeke Harmon. Back at the tavern, Clint Radisson kept wiping glasses and slamming them harder than needed onto the rack. He caught glances but didn't care. He'd grown up in Bardstown, knew every shortcut and last name in the county. He thought he knew who could be humiliated and who couldn't. But that night, It became clear Clint didn't know who Zeke Harmon really was. 10 miles outside of town, in a modest one-story house tucked beside a gravel road, Zeke sat on the back porch with his niece's dog curled at his feet. The beer he'd wanted earlier was now in his hand, cracked open from the six-pack his niece brought from the fridge without asking questions. Her name was Monique Carter. She was a nurse at the local clinic, and sharp as a blade. "You want to talk about it?" she asked gently, leaning against the porch rail. Zeke sipped from the bottle. "Not much to say. I heard it from 2 people already," she replied. "Said you walked into Rusty Jack's and walked right back out." "Didn't like the music," Zeke said dryly. A ghost of a smile played on his face, but it didn't last. Monique didn't press him. She knew her uncle well, knew what kind of strength lived in silence. He'd raised her after her mother, his sister, passed away. She remembered being 9 years old, watching him do push-ups in the living room during commercials. Even then, she knew he was different from the other men in their family. Inside the house, the phone rang. Not a text, a call. That old landline Zeke insisted they keep. Monique picked it up, expecting a telemarketer. But the voice on the other end was steady and low. "This Ezekiel Harmon's line?" "He's here," she said. "Who's calling?" "This is Nolan Vickers," the man replied. "Tell him it's urgent." Zeke stood before she even handed him the receiver. Something about Nolan's name always made his posture straighten. He took the phone. "Vickers." "You all right?" Nolan asked. No small talk. "Fine," Zeke replied. "Don't lie to me," Nolan said. "I heard what happened." Zeke let out a breath. "Not worth your time. You let me be the judge of that." There was a pause, the kind that carried weight. Then Nolan said, "You know what I remember about you? That time in Fallujah, when they pinned us down near the radio tower. You dragged 2 of us out under fire, came back for a 3rd, took shrapnel to the thigh, and still covered our exit. And you didn't say a damn word about it for weeks." Zeke didn't respond. "Now some guy at a bar talks to you like you're less than a man, and you're just gonna let that sit? It ain't about pride," Zeke said quietly. "It's about not letting hate drag me into the mud." "You think walking out made you weak?" Nolan asked. "No," Zeke answered. "I think walking in made him small." Another pause. "Then let's show him how big the rest of us still are," Nolan said. Before Zeke could object, Nolan had already hung up. That night, calls went out to Arkansas, Missouri, Indiana, Tennessee. The old SEAL crew, some retired, some still working, all bonded tighter than blood, got the same message. "Zeke's been disrespected. We ride tomorrow." By midnight, the plan was in motion. Meanwhile, in Bardstown, 2 more people quit their jobs at Rusty Jack's. The 19-year-old waitress who'd stared at her shoes told her mother she didn't want to work for someone who'd throw out a Navy vet. And the dishwasher, an older guy named Lee Ransom, left his apron hanging on the back door and never came back. The next morning, Clint opened his bar early and noticed something off. Too quiet. No regulars. No orders coming in. Then he saw the pickup across the street. It wasn't familiar, but the license plate told him all he needed to know. But what Clint didn't realize was that the man in that truck was just the first of many. Clint Radisson stood behind the bar, scrubbing the same spot on the counter for 10 straight minutes. The smell of fryer oil clung to the air, but no one was eating. No one was even talking. His bartender had called in sick. The cook, Marvin, never showed. And even Becky, the one waitress who'd stuck around through every drunken brawl and lewd joke, hadn't answered her phone. Across the street, the truck sat there, still, big, mud-caked, with Arkansas tire tags. Clint tried to shrug it off, tried to tell himself it was just some traveler passing through. But something about the way it didn't move all morning made his chest tighten. He poured himself a coffee he didn't want and took it to the back office. Meanwhile, 2 states away, in a quiet brick house in Paragould, Arkansas, Nolan Vickers hung up his second phone call of the morning. He rubbed his hands together, slow, then glanced at the clock. 6:43 a.m. Plenty of time. He opened a worn leather binder sitting on his kitchen table, addresses, contacts, unit numbers. Some had stars next to their names. A few were crossed out, but the rest? Still breathing, still loyal. He picked up the phone again. Cal? Vickers? You free today? I can be. What's going on? It's Zeke. There was a long pause. Then, where and when? Nolan gave him the town. Bardstown. He didn't need to say much more. Over the next few hours, Nolan made 11 more calls. One to Frank Odom, now in Indiana, who ran a body shop and still did 200 push-ups every morning. One to Terence Boone, who'd lost half his hearing but never missed a fight. Another to Ray Gutierrez, who taught firearms safety in Knoxville and kept every one of their team photos on his garage wall. Every man had his own life now. Some had wives, some lived alone, some had bad knees or stents in their hearts. But every single one of them asked the same thing once they heard Zeke's name. You need me there? By mid-morning, Nolan's truck was packed. He slid his old Seal Trident into the dash, the same way he always did on the rare days he needed to remember who he'd been. As he backed out of his driveway, his wife, Annette, stood on the porch in her robe, arms folded. You bringing a gun? She asked. Nope, he said. Don't need one. She nodded. Tell Zeke I said hi. Down in Tennessee, Ray Gutierrez locked the front of his range and put up a handwritten sign that read, Closed for Brotherhood. Cal packed a bag, grabbed a canister of pain cream for his knee, and threw it in the back seat. Boone, who had just made pancakes for his granddaughter, kissed her on the head, told his daughter he'd be back tomorrow, and pulled his leather vest from the closet. One by one they hit the road. Some drove alone, others with a co-pilot. A few brought their dogs, mostly big mutts with names like Duke and Roscoe. They didn't blast music. They didn't call ahead. They just came. Meanwhile, back in Bardstown, Zeke sat on the edge of Monique's couch, one foot tapping, the other stiff. His hands were calloused, folded over his lap. You knew they'd come, Monique said, handing him a mug of coffee. I hoped they wouldn't, Zeke said, then added, but I knew they would. He looked out the window, scanning the horizon like he used to back in Kandahar. Quietly, thoughtfully. I didn't ask for this, he said. You didn't have to, Monique replied. They remember. That matters. Zeke didn't respond. But deep down, it hit him. He hadn't been forgotten. But as trucks started pulling off the highway and creeping down Main Street, even the townspeople who had stayed silent the day before began to realize something bigger was brewing. By early afternoon, the weather had turned strange. The sky hung low over Bardstown, like it hadn't decided yet whether to rain or just stay grey. But down on Main Street, no one was thinking about the sky. They were watching the road. The first to arrive was Nolan. His truck pulled into the small gravel lot behind Rusty Jack's and sat there like a monument. Then came Frank in his Dodge Ram, followed by Ray, then Boone. Some wore vests. Some wore denim jackets with faded patches. Some wore nothing but old jeans and t-shirts. But every one of them carried the same quiet look, the one you earn when you've faced things most men wouldn't survive. By 2:15 p.m., there were 10 vehicles parked nose to nose across from the bar. 2 motorcycles, too. Terence always did prefer the open ride. Locals peeked from their storefronts. The man who ran the hardware store next door came out, wiped his hands on a rag, and said under his breath, Ain't seen nothing like this since the parade back in '91. At the gas station on the corner, teenagers stopped pretending to be on their phones and just stared. A few took pictures, not sure what they were witnessing. Inside Rusty Jack's, Clint was pacing. He'd already heard from a regular who stopped in just to say, You pissed off the wrong man, Clint. Now he kept glancing out the window every few minutes, pretending he wasn't. His hands shook when he refilled the ketchup bottles. A customer tried to strike up small talk about the baseball game. Clint didn't answer. At 2:35, the door to the bar opened. Nolan walked in first. He was a large man. Not bulky, just solid, like a wall that had never crumbled. Hair cut close, boots worn but clean. His eyes scanned the room once, then he walked straight to the bar and sat. Frank followed, then Boone, then Ray. one after another until 9 of them were seated, every other bar stool filled. Terence leaned against the jukebox, arms folded. 2 more stood near the windows. The room had gone quiet again. Nobody said a word. But no one left either. Clint came out from the back with a dish rag still in his hand. He froze when he saw them all seated, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to run or serve them. Nolan looked him in the eye. 10 Budweisers, he said, calm as Sunday morning. Clint hesitated. His jaw worked like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Then, slowly, he reached for the taps. Each pint landed on the bar with a soft thud. Boone picked his up, took a sip, then turned slightly and said loud enough for the room to hear, "Funny. Didn't know this place served our kind anymore." The bar stayed silent, but the point had landed. Clint didn't respond. His face was flushed now. Embarrassed? Angry? Maybe both. A man near the pool table stood, finished his drink fast, and slipped out the door without a word. One of the local women at a corner booth pulled her phone out but didn't type anything. Just held it in her lap, like it might be her way out. Nolan leaned forward, elbows on the counter. "You remember who Zeke Harmon is?" he asked Clint. Clint cleared his throat, then said, "I don't want any trouble." "That's good," Nolan replied, "because we didn't come for trouble. We came to sit." Clint's eyes darted toward the door, then toward the register. Sweat beaded at his temple. Frank chuckled. "Relax, Radisson. No one's here to throw fists. You already lost the only fight that mattered." Clint stared at them. "You think this is going to scare me?" "No," said Boone. "We think it might remind you." "Remind me of what? Who built this country?" Ray said. "And who bled for your right to be a loud-mouthed fool?" Nolan raised his glass and added, "And who refuses to be pushed out of a damn bar just because somebody doesn't like what they see?" But as the door opened once more and every head turned toward the entrance, Clint realized the one man he hoped wouldn't show had just walked in. Zeke Harmon stepped inside like he had nothing to prove, because he didn't. He wore a simple button-up shirt, sleeves rolled just below the elbows, and dark jeans that hung a bit loose over his boots. His seal cap was back on his head, bent slightly at the brim the way he always wore it. No flash, no attitude, just presence. The room didn't go silent. It was already silent. He scanned the bar once. Didn't need to count the men lined up across the stools. He knew them by feel, by the way they breathed in rhythm without trying, by the weight in the room. His brothers were here. Clint Radisson took a step back. Just instinct. Not fear exactly, but that twitch that kicks in when your confidence meets a wall you can't bluff your way around. Zeke walked slowly. Each step had purpose. Not for show, but because his knee wouldn't let him move fast even if he wanted to. He passed the booth where a man pretended to look at his phone. Past the woman who suddenly found interest in her drink. Reached the bar. He didn't sit. He stood behind Nolan and said, "You didn't need to do this." Nolan looked up at him. "We know." Zeke glanced at the others. Terence gave him a nod. Boone tipped his glass. Ray didn't say anything, just raised his beer slightly, then drank. Zeke turned to Clint. Locked eyes with him. No rage, no loud voice, just quiet steel. "You remember me now?" he asked. Clint tried to smirk. "You made a scene yesterday." Zeke raised an eyebrow. "You threw me out. I run this place. I decide who stays." Zeke leaned on the bar, not to challenge, just to steady his knee. "You ever serve?" he asked. Clint scoffed. "Don't need to have worn a uniform to be a man." Zeke nodded slowly. "Fair. But you sure as hell should know how to respect one." Clint looked around, noticed every pair of eyes locked on him. No backup, no staff, no one to buffer his ego, just truth pressing in from every angle. Ray broke the silence. "You looked at that man and saw skin. We looked at him and saw blood spilled for us." Frank added, "We've all been under fire. We've all been hungry, dirty, and cold. But the one thing we never tolerated? Disrespect." Boone leaned forward. "He dragged me out of a river in Iraq, shot in the leg, bleeding out. You think I'm going to let some bitter bar owner tell him where he can sit?" Terence shook his head. "You're lucky this is all that showed up." Clint stiffened, still trying to hold on to whatever pride he had left. You came to shame me? What's the point? You think I care what a bunch of washed-up soldiers think? Zeke didn't blink. No, he said quietly. We didn't come to shame you. We came to remind people watching that silence doesn't mean approval, and that respect is earned, but also defended. He stepped back, looked toward the exit. I'm not staying. I've got nothing to prove to you. But you'll remember this day, because one day, someone might treat you like you treated me, and you'll know exactly what it feels like. He turned and walked out. No one followed him. Not yet. Clint didn't say anything. Just stood there, face flushed, the echo of Zeke's words hanging heavy in the air. Nolan finished his beer and stood. Then Frank. Then Boone, Ray, and the rest. They didn't throw chairs, didn't slam fists. They just filed out one by one, their footsteps the only sound in the room. A woman near the corner finally whispered, "That man saved lives." No one answered her. There wasn't anything left to say. But outside, as the men gathered around Zeke, something deeper settled. Not revenge, not anger, but a quiet satisfaction that the world had been reminded what brotherhood really meant. The street outside Rusty Jack's looked like a reunion from another life. Zeke stood in the middle of the group, arms crossed, while the others gathered around him, not in formation, but in instinct. No one said much, a few small smirks. A slap on the back. Nolan passed him a bottle of water like they were in Kandahar again, cooling down after a long op. Zeke cracked it open and took a sip. "Didn't expect this," he muttered. Terence laughed. "You think we were just gonna let that slide?" "You know I wasn't looking for backup," Zeke said. "Didn't come to back you up." Frank cut in. "We came to stand beside you. Big difference." Boone leaned on his cane and squinted toward the bar. "Place looks smaller now, don't it?" Zeke chuckled under his breath. Maybe it always was. They stood like that for a while, not moving, letting the town see. People from nearby shops had stepped out quietly. A few filmed, most just watched. They weren't cheering or waving flags. They were witnessing. Zeke's niece, Monique, pulled up in her Civic, parked crooked, and stepped out with that familiar look. Half pride, half warning. "You good?" she asked. "I'm fine," Zeke said. She looked at the others, gave a small nod of thanks, and stepped back, arms folded. Nolan looked around. "You sure you're done here?" Zeke stared at the bar's faded front. He could still see Clint's face from earlier. The pride, the panic, the weight of being exposed. "I walked out yesterday," Zeke said, "because he made me feel like I didn't belong." Nolan nodded slowly. "And?" Zeke turned to face the doors again. "I think I'd like to walk back in. This time, on my terms." Ray opened the door without a word. The creak of its hinges broke the still air. Zeke stepped forward. Inside, Clint had just finished pouring himself a drink when the door opened again. He looked up, and for a second the world narrowed. Zeke walked in alone this time, not flanked by his SEAL team, not escorted by brothers. Just one man walking into a room he'd been told he didn't belong in. He didn't sit, didn't approach the bar. He stood in the center of the room, scanning the faces that had stayed. Fewer now, but enough. "I was born in 51, Zeke began. "Joined the Navy at 18, became a SEAL at 23, served in 4 major operations. Lost friends, lost blood, lost time." Clint stood frozen behind the bar, unsure of what to do with his hands. "All I wanted yesterday was a beer," Zeke said. "Not a parade, not a thank you, just a stool and a TV and a cold drink." He let the silence stretch. "When you looked at me and told me to leave, you didn't just see a man. You saw a reason to hate. You thought I wouldn't push back." Clint said nothing. "You were right," Zeke continued. "I didn't. Because I've fought harder fights than you'll ever know. I don't need to swing fists to remind someone what they are." He paused, then looked around the bar. Not just at Clint, but at the bystanders. "Some of you stayed silent yesterday. Some of you spoke up today. That's the difference a night can make. That's the difference memory makes. Zeke adjusted his cap. I'm not here to change your mind, just to make sure you remember mine. Then he turned and walked back out. Outside, the team waited. They hadn't moved. He didn't say a word as he rejoined them, just nodded once. Terence clapped him on the back. That felt right. Damn right it did, Frank said. Nolan smiled. We came for respect. You just took it back. But while the team was ready to leave Bardstown behind, the town itself wasn't done with them yet. The next morning, Bardstown didn't feel quite the same. People still went to work. The diner on Walnut Street still served black coffee in chipped mugs. But there was a weight in the air, a collective awareness that something had shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. At the gas station, a man in coveralls told his co-worker, "That old seal, Zeke, he stood taller than anyone I've ever seen, and he didn't even raise his voice." Across town, a teacher used Zeke's name as an example in her history class, explaining to her students that courage doesn't always look like a battlefield. Sometimes it looks like a man walking back into a place that disrespected him, just to prove he still belongs. By noon, a new sign had gone up in the window of Rusty Jack's. It didn't come from Clint. It came from Becky, the waitress who hadn't shown up the day before but returned that morning, not to work, but to tape a handwritten note on the glass. Veterans welcome. Always. Inside, Clint sat in the darkened bar alone. He hadn't opened for lunch, couldn't face it yet, couldn't face what people now saw when they looked at him. His pride had always been the loudest man in the room, but now it was quiet. Because no matter how many drinks he poured, he knew one thing: no one would forget what happened. Meanwhile, Zeke and Monique stood on her porch again, sipping from mugs while the dog dozed in the sun at their feet. "You know they're still talking about it," Monique said. Zeke exhaled, slow. "Let him. You think Clint learned anything?" Zeke shrugged. "I don't care if he did. I care if the people who watched did." She nodded. "Fair." He looked out across the field. "I fought in wars that most people only see on the History Channel. But the kind of fight I walked into yesterday, that one never ends." Monique sat beside him. "You still thinking about leaving?" Zeke shook his head. "No, I've still got more to teach." That evening, a letter arrived. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single folded page that read, "Mr. Harmon, I was in the bar that day. I didn't say anything. I regret that. I want to do better. Thank you for showing me how. Just a guy who watched." Zeke read it twice, then tucked it in the inside pocket of his jacket. A few towns over, Nolan and the rest of the SEAL team were back to their routines. Some of them stayed in touch, some didn't. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that when one of them needed the others, they came. Not to fight, not to threaten, just to stand beside him. To remind a town, and maybe a country, that brotherhood isn't something you hang on a wall. It's something you live, and that the weight of silence can be just as heavy as the force of words. That weekend, a small local paper ran a story on the incident. It didn't go viral. It didn't make national news. But for the people who read it, it hit hard. It ended with a quote from one of the townsfolk who'd been sitting at the pool table that first day. "That man didn't raise his voice, didn't throw a punch, but when he stood there, facing down that bar, he made all of us ask who we really are." Zeke didn't need applause. He didn't need a headline. He just needed people to remember. And they did. Life has a way of testing us in quiet moments, not just with what we do, but with what we let happen. If you were moved by this story, share it. Let someone else hear what dignity looks like. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. We've got more stories that matter.